How are we doing, everyone? We've got a Bulls game later today, their last one before we head into the All-Star break. Hopefully the Bulls can close it out against a struggling Kings team, but not only that, it's Wednesday, and you know by now that every Wednesday on this channel I feature a series between your Bulls hot takes and your would you rather scenarios, and this week we're going to be going over your would you rather scenarios. And by the way, I need to figure out how to better title these videos because I can't tell you how many people come at me in the comments section thinking that the title is my take versus a take from a subscriber. As I always say, best to watch the video before commenting. But anyway, if you're new to the channel, feel free to leave your takes in the comments of any video on this channel, or you can do so in the Discord as well, which is linked below and also free to join. I believe we have about 800 members in there now, so check it out if you're interested. It's a great place to talk basketball with other Bulls fans in the community. Also, a huge shout out to benchmob.com for sponsoring this video, and they've got brand new gear, but more on that in a little bit. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Our first take comes to us from Mr. Writing Man. Would you rather have prime Derrick Rose on the Bulls but replace Lonzo Ball, or have a slightly past his prime Kevin Garnett 2011 to 2013 and replace Tony Bradley? I'm curious if you go for talent or for fit. Oh man, this is a really good one. And by the way, I'm always curious to hear what your guys' preferences would be in these scenarios. Like, I don't want to just listen to myself trying to solve for these, so let me know what you guys would rather do for some of these in the comments. But in this one, this is tough because yes, prime Rose, I mean, we're talking about MVP Derrick Rose was on a whole nother level in terms of sheer talent. Like forget the potential that was never realized because of his injuries. Like, Derrick Rose was a top 5 player in the league at one point. And yes, Lonzo Ball is good and certainly fits a need for the Bulls, being a strong perimeter defender and playmaker, but he's nowhere near even close to the level of greatness that Rose was in his heyday. That being said, though, Lonzo Ball is a much better player than Tony Bradley. And you're talking about removing Bradley for a slightly past his prime Kevin Garnett in 2011 and 2013. And by the way, he was still an all-star then. You know, might have been more so because, you know, he was recognized as a perennial all-star, so he probably got those selections more than he actually deserved. But either way, he was still an incredible player even by 2011. He was still a strong scorer, a monster on the boards, good mid-range game, and a decent rim protector. Not only that, but Kevin Garnett is arguably one of the greatest power forwards of all time. And what do the Bulls need more than anything right now? Yeah, a power forward. And a power forward who has that dog-like mentality and energizer, a guy who will get into the opponent's head. Like, I never liked Kevin Garnett in his playing days. I could not stand the dude, but we could certainly use a guy like him on this roster. But man, prime Rose. Can you imagine MVP Rose with Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan, and Vucevic? Like, yes, the Bulls are still lacking at the 4 spot, but boy, that would be an incredibly talented, super entertaining, and monster of a team. I know this is probably going to be a little biased because Rose is a Bulls legend and I was never a fan of Kevin Garnett, but I think I would take Rose replacing Lonzo over KG replacing Tony Bradley. I guess that means I'm taking talent over fit. That was a really good one though. Next, we've got Rebager1. Would you rather have Franz Wagner or Io? Oh man, so obviously the Franz Wagner question comes because, as most know, Wagner was the player selected by the Magic using the Bulls lottery pick that we made in the trade for Nikola Vucevic. So I know there is always going to be this sentiment of, well, what could have been had we just drafted Wagner and not made the trade for Vucevic, which I've always said before, without Vucevic, you're likely not going to get DeMar DeRozan. But part of the reason why you bring in all-star level talent is to attract more all-star level talent in free agency. But that aside, I mean, Wagner is having an incredible rookie season, a top 5 player in his rookie class, no question. And only being 20 years old, who knows what the limit is for this kid based on what we're seeing right now in his rookie season. All of that being said though, and I know this is going to sound a little biased, and it probably is to an extent, but I think there is also some truth to it. There's something to be said about putting up the kind of numbers that Franz Wagner's doing on one of the worst teams in the league versus Io, who is playing on a top Eastern Conference team, who, mind you, didn't get a lot of playing time to start the season and has since started thriving, being thrusted in a more prominent role. And at the end of the day, sure, Wagner looks better than Io does right now, but I think Io's future potential and ceiling is higher than Wagner's is. And a lot of that has to do with Io's future to-way potential in being a great player on both sides of the floor, whereas Wagner probably is only going to excel on the offensive end only. I don't see much defensive potential coming from him. And to be honest, I also wouldn't be surprised if Wagner is one of these players who has surprisingly a good rookie season and kind of tapers off around, his 4th or 5th year in the league, kind of like a Lauri Markkanen. Next, we've got the Benny. Would you rather have prime LaVine, DeRozan, and Vooch, or prime Butler, Wade, and Gasol on today's Bulls team. So if you mean each of these players being in their primes, which I consider Levine to be in his prime right now, you can even make the case that DeRozan is as well, based on how he's playing. Vucevic, we'll say at the height, for his prime was in the Orlando days, but still a great player. I would still consider him pretty close to his prime. But then Butler, Wade, and Gasol, all in their primes. I mean, I know people were disappointed with Wade in his lone season in Chicago, but I think some people forget that prime Dwayne Wade, the guy who won a title at 23, winning a finals MVP at 23, who won 2 more later with LeBron, prime Wade was a top 3 player in the NBA. That can't be said about the rest of the guys that are on this list. Pau Gasol in his prime was a perennial all-star and an all-NBA player, one of the greatest big men in the league in his prime. And then Jimmy Butler, we know what Butler is and how good he is, whether we put, his prime a couple years ago, or we still consider him to be in his prime today. He's an incredible player, but really because we're talking about prime D Wade being on one of these teams, I don't think it's even hard to take the trio of Butler, Wade, and Gasol all in their primes. Before I get into the next take, I did want to share an update from one of the longtime sponsors of this channel, and that is benchmob.com. And they have just launched some of their newest gear, including their new design of the Shy Slamma Jamma t-shirt, as well as a brand new hoodie and beanies to get you through those winter months in Chicago. If you guys remember the days of the Bench Mob, well, the Bench Mob is back. When they're healthy anyway, they're back. So get your Bench Mob gear to support the Bench Mob, and they're giving an exclusive offer for this channel of 20% off your order when you use the code BullsCentral20. A link to the site as well as the code can be found in the description. So thank you to benchmob.com for sponsoring the video. And now let's get back into some of these Would You Rathers. So next we've got Kyson Eilers. Would you rather go back in time and live through the 90s Bulls dynasty and you get to experience that, or go back to the late 2000s, at the beginning of the Rose era, to live through that and Rose never get injured? Well, some of you might not know, but I'm kind of old. I'd like to think that I'm still young, but at some point you have to accept that you're just getting old. But because I'm old, I was very fortunate enough to have lived through the 90s Bulls era. Granted, I was a kid, and to be honest, the first championship I have no recollection of. I was just too young, only 5 years old and in my own world at that time. But the first championship I do remember was the win over the Blazers, and that's actually how I got hooked on the game of basketball and became a Bulls fan. Now, the second three-peat I had a much greater appreciation for because I was a little older, I understood the game more, followed it a little more closely. I started playing organized basketball in school, so it was a different feeling for me than those first 3 years. But anyway, so because I actually did live through those 90s dynasty years and had the privilege of watching the greatest player of all time play in his prime, I would much prefer going back to the late 2000s and early 2010s with the hypothetical scenario of Rose having never gotten injured, because I've said it multiple times, it's one of the biggest what ifs in sports on what would have become of Derrick Rose and how far the Bulls could have gone had Rose never got injured. Next, we've got Cy. If there was a Bulls game at the same time as the Super Bowl, would you rather watch the Bulls game or the Super Bowl? Yeah, I mean, you guys probably caught my video from earlier this week in which I said I'm not a big football fan. I've never really been a football fan either. Basketball has always been kind of my sport throughout my childhood until now. I still watch the Super Bowl, and I watched the past one that just happened on Sunday, but if there was a Bulls game going on at the same time, which they would never do since the NBA doesn't schedule games during the Super Bowl, but if they did, yeah, I'd watch the Bulls game, no question, even if it was a boring game or they're playing against someone like the Pistons. Next, we've got Lauri Markkanen. Would you rather have prime/young D Rose or Rodman on this current roster? Wow, a lot of prime D Rose scenarios in this one. I mean, I guess this kind of goes back to the fit versus talent argument, right? Like, Rodman would fit exponentially better on this team, given he was an absolute monster of a defender at the 4, a beast on the boards, and he also just had that fire and tenacity that the Bulls team, this team, could really use in the front court. But again, we're talking about a prime Derrick Rose, an MVP caliber level player, granted, unlike the last scenario in which we're talking about Rose versus Kevin Garnett, and that one, you're replacing Rose with Lonzo Ball. In this hypothetical scenario, we're not replacing anybody. So by adding Rose, you're talking about an incredibly crowded backcourt that the Bulls currently have. Like before, you were replacing Rose with Lonzo. At least it was filling a spot taken on the backcourt rather than just adding another player to it. Also, prime Rodman is better than past prime Kevin Garnett. So I do feel like, I'm kind of crazy for saying this, but man, this team would be deadly if you added Rodman to it. Like, Rose is more talented, there's no question about that, but Rodman would be an incredible fit on this roster. And for that reason, I'm taking Rodman. Anyway, guys, I will end it there for this week. Thank you to all those who left their takes in the comments or in the Discord. Next week, we'll rotate to your Bulls hot takes, so make sure you submit your takes to be featured in next week's video. Don't forget, the Bulls will be taking on the Kings tonight at the United Center. I'll have a live game chat for that. Until then, guys, as always, be sure to subscribe if you're a Bulls fan, as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I will catch you in the next one.